They say the Montana wilderness breaks men. I came here to find out if I was already broken. I'm Reid, a city vet who thought he'd seen it all, until I met Colt Blackwood. He didn't just own the ranch, he looked like he was built from the very rock and iron of the mountains. Tonight, a lethal storm is closing in, a prize mare's life hangs in the balance, and the tension between us is about to snap. If you've ever dreamed of leaving it all behind for a man whose silence says more than 1,000 words, stay tuned. This is a story of desperate desire, survival, and the moment everything changed under a big Montana sky.
The Montana sky didn't just change colors at sunset. It bled. It was a bruised, heavy purple that seemed to press down on the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, making the world feel small and infinite all at once. My name is Reid, and as I steered my dust-caked truck up the winding access road of the Blackwood Ranch, I felt every bit the trespasser. Back in Chicago, I was a man of precision, white coats, sterile silver instruments, and the predictable hum of a city that never stopped talking. But as the gravel crunched under my tires and the cell service bars on my dash vanished into nothingness, I realized that my old life didn't mean a damn thing out here. I'd been summoned. Not invited, but summoned. The Blackwood reputation was legendary among veterinarians, not for their hospitality, but for their horses. They bred the kind of stock that looked like it was made of midnight and thunder, but a sickness was sweeping through their stables, a respiratory blight that had already claimed 2 yearlings. I was the last resort. I saw him before I even reached the main house. Colt Blackwood was standing by the heavy timber gate of the primary corral. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, but he occupied the space with the kind of formidable gravity that made the air around him feel denser. He was a mountain of a man, his frame draped in denim jackets so worn it had turned the color of wood smoke. His shoulders were a broad, straight line that looked capable of carrying the weight of the entire valley. He wore a sweat-stained Stetson pulled low, casting his features into a mask of shadow, but I could feel the heat of his gaze tracking my truck from a mile away. I cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. I stepped out, my boots feeling far too clean for this earth. "You're late, Reid," a voice rumbled. It wasn't a shout, it was a low, dry rasp, the sound of stone grinding against stone. It vibrated in my chest before it reached my ears. Colt didn't move from his spot by the fence. He just leaned back, his massive forearms resting on the top rail, the muscles corded and scarred. "The storm slowed me down at the pass," I said, trying to find a footing in my own voice. "The storm didn't slow you down. Your hesitation did," Colt replied, finally tilting his head up. The light caught his jawline, a jagged, unapologetic edge of dark stubble and grit. His eyes were the color of a forest at midnight, deep, dark, and dangerously intelligent. "The mare in stall 4 is the heart of my line. If she stops breathing tonight, you don't get paid and you don't stay. Clear?" The desperate desire to prove myself to this man hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just about the career. It was the way he looked at me, like I was a ghost that hadn't yet decided to be real. "Lead the way," I said, grabbing my medical bag. He didn't offer to help. He just turned and walked toward the massive cedar barn. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic gait, his spurs jingling a slow, metallic tempo. Inside the barn was a cathedral of shadow and scent. It smelled of dried clover, oiled leather, and the sweet, hot musk of animals. In the back stall, a bay mare was heaving, her flanks slicked with a gray, unhealthy sweat. She was beautiful, but her eyes were clouded with pain. "Easy, Duchess," Colt whispered. The change in his voice was staggering. The gravel was gone, replaced by a low, melodic tenderness that made my throat tight. He stepped into the cramped stall, and the space immediately felt too small. To get to her, I had to move into his circle. As I stepped beside him, our arms brushed. The heat radiating off him was a shock, a fierce, natural warmth that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. He was a wall of solid oak. I could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, a powerful engine of a man standing inches from me. "I need to sedate her to clear the airway," I whispered, my hands trembling slightly as I prepped the syringe. "She doesn't like needles," Colt grunted, moving to her head. He wrapped one massive arm around her neck, pulling the mare's head against his chest. He buried his face in her mane, murmuring words I couldn't hear. The sight was breathtaking, this formidable, rugged giant cradling a dying animal as if she were made of glass. "Hold her steady, Colt. If she thrashes, we're both going through that wall." "She won't thrash," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You just do what you came here to do."
For hours, the world outside the barn ceased to exist. There were no cities, no galleries, no reputations. There was only the yellow glow of the lantern, the sound of the mare's ragged breathing, and the physical presence of Colt Blackwood. We worked in a synchronized, desperate rhythm. When I needed a light held, he was there. When I needed the mare shifted, his raw strength moved her like she weighed nothing. At one point, the mare panicked, her hoofs striking the wooden floor with a sound like a gunshot. I stumbled back, losing my balance in the slick straw. Colt's hand shot out, catching me by the waist. His grip was like an iron band, unyielding and shockingly strong. He pulled me flush against him to steady me. For a heartbeat, my face was pressed against the rough denim of his jacket. I could hear his heart, a slow, steady thud that seemed to command the room. The scent of him, leather, rain, and pure, unfiltered man, swirled in my head, igniting a hunger I had spent years burying under paperwork. He didn't let go immediately. He looked down at me, his breath warm against my forehead. "You okay, Reid?" "Yeah," I managed to breathe, my voice hitching. "I'm okay." He released me, but the ghost of his touch stayed on my skin like a brand. By midnight, the mare's fever finally broke. Her breathing slowed, becoming deep and regular. The crisis had passed, but the air in the barn had only grown thicker, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with medicine. Colt stood up, wiping the sweat and grime from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He looked exhausted, but even in his weariness, he looked like a king of the dirt. He walked to the barn door and pushed it open. The storm had arrived in full force. A wall of white wind and sleet roared across the yard, swallowing the truck and the path to the guest house. "Road's gone," Colt said, staring out into the chaos. "You aren't going anywhere tonight, Reid." He turned back to me, the lantern light catching the dark intensity in his eyes. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was the only thing standing between me and the cold. And as he stepped closer, the desperate desire for the country life and for the man who ruled it became the only truth I had left. "You'll stay in the main house," he commanded, "with me."
The main house of the Blackwood Ranch wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Built from hand-hewn logs and river stone, it sat on the edge of the ridge like it was daring the Montana winds to try and move it. Inside, the air smelled of aged cedar, gun oil, and the lingering warmth of a dying fire. As Colt kicked the heavy oak door shut against the howling sleet, the silence that followed was deafening. "Bathroom's down the hall. Towels are in the press," Colt grunted, shedding his wet denim jacket. Underneath, he wore a thermal shirt that clung to the topographical map of his torso. His back was a broad expanse of muscle that moved with a heavy, fluid power as he reached for a bottle of whiskey on the sideboard. He didn't ask if I wanted a drink, he just poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the low light of the embers. I stood there, drenched and shivering, feeling like an alien in this temple of rugged masculinity. "Thanks," I muttered, taking the glass. My fingers brushed his, a brief electric spark that made my pulse jump. "Get out of those wet clothes, Reid. I don't need a sick vet on top of a sick mare," he said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I retreated to the bathroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I stripped off my soaked gear and let the scalding water of the shower hit my skin, I couldn't get the image of him out of my head, the way he looked at me in the barn, the way his hand had felt on my waist. There was a formidable quality to him that I'd never encountered in the city. Men in Chicago were loud. Colt was a landslide, silent until he moved, and then unstoppable. When I stepped back into the living room, dressed in a pair of borrowed sweats that were far too big for me, I found him sitting by the hearth. The fire was roaring now, casting dancing orange shadows across his rugged features. He had changed into a dark flannel shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the thick, powerful column of his neck. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the leather armchair across from him. I sat, the desperate desire for something real, something raw, thick in the back of my throat. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the logs and the scream of the wind outside. "Why'd you come out here, city boy?" Colt asked suddenly, his dark eyes fixed on mine. "Vets with your credentials don't usually trade a climate-controlled surgery for a pile of hay in the middle of a blizzard." "I was tired of the noise, Colt," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Tired of people who look at everything but see nothing. I wanted to see if I still had any grit left."
Colt leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The movement brought him closer, into my personal space. The scent of him, oak, tobacco, and pure, unfiltered man was intoxicating. "Grit isn't something you find, Reid. It's something you're born with, or something that's beaten into you by the land." He reached out, his large, calloused thumb catching a stray drop of water that had escaped my hair and traveled down my neck. The touch was slow, deliberate, and devastating. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. "You did good tonight," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips. "Most men would have broken under that mare's weight. You didn't." The tension in the room was no longer about the storm. It was about the two of us, stripped of our titles and our defenses. I looked at him, this formidable man who lived by the laws of the wild, and I realized I didn't want to be safe. I wanted to be consumed. "Colt," I whispered, my voice thick with a hunger I could no longer hide. He didn't say a word. He stood up, towering over me, a silhouette of raw power against the firelight. He reached down, his hands sliding into my hair, tilting my head back. His eyes were no longer midnight. They were a forest on fire. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Reid." "Then show me," I challenged. He leaned in, his lips inches from mine, his heat enveloping me. The morning broke with a blinding, crystalline clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch buried under a 3-foot blanket of pristine white. But inside the house, nothing would ever be the same. The night had been a blur of desperate intensity. Being with Colt was like being caught in a tide. There was no fighting it, only the choice to sink or swim. He was every bit as formidable as I had imagined, strong, demanding, but possessed of a hidden, aching tenderness that only surfaced in the dark. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. I found Colt in the kitchen, his back to me as he worked the stove. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver in his dark hair. He looked different this morning. Still a mountain of a man, but the sharp edges of his suspicion had been sanded down. "Mare's up," he said without turning around. "She's eating. You saved her, Reid."
I walked up behind him, my hand hovering near the small of his back, before I gathered the courage to touch him. "We saved her, Colt." He turned, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he reached out and pulled me into his space. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his thumb grazing my jawline. "I've spent 40 years on this ranch alone. I thought that was the only way to live. Thought the land was the only thing worth my time." "And now?" I asked. "And now I think the land is going to have to share me," he grumbled, a rare, lopsided smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile that could melt the Montana winter. The country life wasn't a dream anymore. It was a reality. Over the next week, as the snow began to melt, the dynamics of the Blackwood Ranch shifted. I stayed. I helped with the herd. I learned the language of the mountains, and every night I returned to the formidable man who had claimed me in the storm. We were standing on the porch on my final night before I had to go back to Chicago to settle my affairs. The stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in the fabric of heaven. "You coming back?" Colt asked, his voice steady, but I could hear the slight tremor of uncertainty. I looked out at the vast, beautiful, brutal landscape. I thought of the noise of the city, the hollow successes, and the loneliness of the crowd. Then I looked at Colt, the man who had given me a reason to breathe again. "Try and stop me," I said. He let out a low, huffed laugh and pulled me into his arms, his chest a safe harbor against the coming night. We were two men shaped by different worlds, brought together by a dying horse and a mountain storm. But out here, under the wide Montana sky, we had finally found where we belonged. The dust has finally settled on the Blackwood Ranch, but for Colt and Reid, the journey is just beginning. Stories like these remind us that no matter how lost we feel, there is always a path home. Sometimes it just takes a formidable man and a Montana storm to help us find it. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the heat of the barn and the silence of the woods, please like this video and subscribe to Gay Stories Chronicles. Your support allows me to keep bringing these characters to life, providing a safe haven for all of us who dream of a love that survives the wild. Tell me in the comments what part of Colt and Reid's story resonated with you the most. I read every single one. Thank you for being part of our chronicle. I'll see you in the next story.